A child is seconds away from a meltdown. You can see it before it happens. The jaw tightens, the breathing changes, the body becomes restless in a way that doesn't look serious, yet. And then, in most homes, everything happens too fast. Stop! Calm down! That's enough! The reaction is immediate. The goal is control. And for a moment, it works. The child pauses. The noise drops. The situation looks handled. But here's the part nobody sees. Nothing actually changed. Because what just happened was not regulation. It was interruption. An interruption does something very specific. It stops the behavior in the moment, but it leaves the system underneath exactly the same. So the next time the pressure builds, the same thing happens again and again. And slowly, something begins to form. Not calm, not discipline, but dependency. A pattern where the child learns, I can't handle this moment. Someone else will step in. I don't need to figure it out. And over time, that becomes automatic. Now imagine the same moment handled differently. Same child, same rising emotion, same early signals. But this time, the parent doesn't react immediately. No yelling, no correction, no rush to control. Just a pause. A few seconds where nothing obvious is done. And at first, it feels uncomfortable because everything inside says, do something, but nothing happens. And then, something unexpected begins to happen. The escalation slows down. Not instantly, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to change the direction of the moment. Instead of exploding, it hesitates. Instead of getting louder, it softens slightly. And then, a small pause appears. And inside that pause, the child is doing something that changes everything. They're trying to hold the emotion, trying to make sense of what they feel, trying without being told exactly how. And that attempt, even if it's small, is where real development begins. Because discipline is not built when behavior is controlled. It's built when the child learns how to control themselves. And that process cannot happen if every moment is taken away too quickly. Most systems are built around reacting after something goes wrong. Stop the behavior, correct the mistake, fix the problem. But this system works differently. It doesn't wait for the behavior. It focuses on what creates the behavior. Because behavior is not random. It's a signal, a reflection of something underneath that isn't fully developed yet. When a child screams instead of speaking, they're not choosing chaos. They're missing emotional language. When a child refuses to cooperate, they're not being difficult. They're missing flexibility. When a child melts down, they're not lacking discipline. They're missing regulation. And this is the shift most people never make. You don't punish what doesn't exist. You build it. And building takes time. It takes repetition. It takes space. It takes moments where the child is allowed to try, even if they don't succeed. Because success is not the goal in that moment. Growth is. And growth only happens when the child is part of the process, not removed from it, which is why reacting too quickly can interrupt something important. It removes the exact moment where development happens. That small window between emotion and reaction, where the brain is trying to figure something out. And when that window disappears, so does the opportunity. So instead of reacting immediately, there is a pause. Not a long one, not silence, just a few seconds, where nothing is forced, nothing is corrected, nothing is controlled. And in those few seconds, the brain begins to engage. The child begins to think, to process, to attempt. Maybe they hesitate, maybe they struggle, maybe they don't get it right, but they try. And that attempt is the beginning of self-regulation. Because every time the child tries to manage their own response, something changes, not visibly, not dramatically, but internally. Connections begin to form, patterns begin to repeat. And over time, those patterns become automatic, but only if they are allowed to happen. If they are constantly interrupted, they never fully develop. They remain weak, dependent, incomplete. And that's why control in the moment can actually slow development over time, because it replaces internal growth with external management. And external management doesn't last. It only works when someone is there to apply it. But internal capacity stays, even when no one is watching, even when no one is guiding, even when the moment becomes difficult. And that is the goal. Not perfect behavior, but independent control. Not silence, but stability. And that stability begins in moments that most people overlook. Moments where nothing dramatic is happening. moments where the child is simply trying. And those moments, repeated again and again, begin to shape something deeper, something that doesn't rely on constant correction, something that builds quietly but powerfully. Because every repeated experience becomes a pattern, and every pattern becomes part of how the child responds to the world, which means the smallest moments, handled differently, create the biggest long-term change. That small moment where the child pauses, where nothing looks dramatic from the outside, is actually where everything important is happening. Because in that moment, the child is not being controlled. They are engaging. And that engagement is what builds the system that most people are trying to force: self-regulation. But here's the part that makes this difficult to understand at first. It doesn't feel efficient. It doesn't feel fast. It doesn't give immediate results the way control does. Because control creates instant order, but development creates delayed strength. And most people choose what works now, without realizing what it costs later. Because when a child is constantly guided out of difficult emotional moments, they never fully experience them. And if they never experience them, they never learn how to move through them. So the system stays fragile, dependent, reactive. But when the child is given just enough space, not too much, not too little, something begins to change. The brain starts building connections, not through instruction, but through experience. And this type of learning is different, because it doesn't rely on memory, it relies on repetition. The brain is constantly asking one question: what happens in moments like this? And whatever happens repeatedly becomes the answer. If the pattern is always interruption, the brain learns, I don't need to handle this. If the pattern includes space to try, the brain learns, I can engage with this. And that difference becomes permanent, because over time, the brain stops questioning. It starts predicting. It begins to respond automatically based on past patterns, which means the goal is not to control behavior in one moment. It's to shape the pattern across many moments. And that's where most systems fail. They focus on isolated situations, single reactions, immediate corrections. But development doesn't work in single moments. It works through repetition, through consistency, through small actions that happen again and again. And this is where something deeper begins to form: identity. Not the kind that is spoken, not labels like good or bad, but internal identity, the kind that comes from repeated experience. The child doesn't just behave differently, they begin to see themselves differently, not because someone told them who they are, but because of what they consistently do. A child who is allowed to try begins to see themselves as capable. A child who is trusted with small challenges begins to see themselves as someone who can handle difficulty. A child who participates in daily responsibility begins to see themselves as someone who contributes. And once that identity starts to form, behavior changes naturally, because identity drives action, not rules, not pressure, not control. Identity. This is why repetition matters so much. Not big changes, not dramatic shifts, small, consistent actions, every day. A child putting something back after using it, helping in simple tasks, taking part in routines. At first, it feels too small to matter, too basic, too insignificant. But the brain doesn't measure importance the way we do. It measures frequency. What happens often becomes normal. What becomes normal becomes automatic. And what becomes automatic becomes identity. That's how discipline is built, not forced, not demanded, but formed, through repeated exposure to the same pattern. And over time, that pattern becomes stable, reliable, internal. The child no longer needs reminders, no longer needs correction, because the behavior is not coming from outside anymore, it's coming from within. And this is the point where everything changes, because external control always has a limit. It only works when someone is there to apply it. But internal control doesn't depend on that. It stays, even when no one is watching, even when the situation becomes difficult, even when there is no immediate consequence. And that's what real discipline is, not compliance, not silence, but the ability to manage yourself without being forced. But there's another layer to this, something that makes this system even more powerful: timing. Because when development happens matters just as much as how it happens. If the child is always supported before difficulty appears, they never experience challenge. If they are always left alone after the difficulty becomes overwhelming, they cannot engage. The moment must be balanced, where the challenge exists, but the system can still respond, and that balance is where growth happens. Too much support, and the system doesn't develop. Too little, and the system collapses. But just enough creates adaptation, and adaptation builds strength. This is why that pause matters so much, because it creates that balance. It allows the child to engage without being overwhelmed, and every time that happens, something improves. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually. The response becomes slightly better, the pause becomes slightly longer, the reaction becomes slightly softer. And those small improvements stack over time until what once felt impossible becomes natural. And this is where most people get it wrong. They expect immediate change. They look for quick results. They want visible proof that something is working. But development doesn't show itself immediately. It builds quietly, beneath the surface, until one day, the reaction is different. The response is calmer. The moment that used to escalate now resolves. And it feels sudden. But it wasn't. It was built. Through every small moment that came before it. Through every pause, every attempt, every repetition. And that's why consistency matters more than intensity. Not doing something perfectly once, but doing something correctly many times. Because the brain doesn't change through intensity. It changes through repetition. And when the repetition is stable, the system becomes stable. And once the system becomes stable, behavior follows. Without force, without pressure, without constant correction. And that is the difference between control and development. Control manages behavior. Development builds the person behind the behavior. And once that person changes, everything else follows. There is a moment that most people overlook. Not because it isn't important, but because it doesn't look like anything special. A child begins to feel something difficult. Frustration, discomfort, pressure. The kind of feeling that used to turn into a reaction almost immediately. The kind that used to escalate fast. But this time, something is different. The reaction doesn't come as quickly. There is a gap, a pause, small, but real. And inside that pause, the child is doing something they couldn't do before. They're holding the feeling. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to stop it from taking over instantly. And that moment, that quiet, almost invisible shift, is where everything you've been building starts to show. Because discipline doesn't appear suddenly. It doesn't arrive in a single breakthrough moment. It forms slowly, through repetition, through experience, through patterns that are repeated so many times, they become automatic. And what you're seeing in that moment is not control. It's capacity. The ability to stay inside an experience without being overwhelmed by it. The ability to pause before reacting. The ability to try instead of collapsing into the same pattern. And that ability is built, not forced, not demanded, but developed. Over time. Through every small moment where the child was allowed to engage, instead of being pulled out too quickly. Through every pause where they were given space to try. Through every repetition where they experienced the same pattern, again and again, until the brain no longer needed to think about it. It simply responded. Because this is how the brain works. It doesn't change through instruction. It changes through experience, through patterns, through what happens repeatedly. Every repeated experience becomes a reference point, a stored expectation of how moments like this usually go. And over time, those expectations turn into automatic responses. So if the repeated pattern is interruption, the response becomes dependency. If the repeated pattern is engagement, the response becomes independence. And that's the difference you're building. Not just better behavior, but a different internal system. A system that doesn't rely on external control. A system that can function on its own. And that system becomes visible in moments like this. Moments where nothing dramatic is happening, but everything has changed. The child is still feeling the emotion, still experiencing the difficulty, but they're not being controlled by it in the same way. They're inside it,
but not overwhelmed by it. And that's the definition of real discipline.
But not overwhelmed by it. And that's the definition of real discipline, not the absence of emotion, but the ability to move through it. Now here's where it becomes even more powerful, because once this system begins to form, it doesn't stay limited to one type of moment, it starts spreading. The same ability to pause shows up in different situations. The same capacity to try appears in new challenges. The same internal control begins to apply across multiple areas. Because the brain doesn't isolate these patterns, it generalizes them. It takes what it has learned in one context and applies it to others. And that's how growth accelerates. Not through new instruction, but through expansion of existing patterns. And over time, those patterns become stable, reliable, consistent. The child doesn't just react better in one moment, they become different in how they approach difficulty altogether. More patient, more controlled, more capable of handling discomfort without immediate escalation. And this is where identity fully forms. Not through words, not through labels, but through repeated experience. The child begins to see themselves as someone who can handle things, someone who can try, someone who doesn't fall apart the moment something becomes difficult. And once that identity locks in, everything becomes easier. Because behavior no longer needs to be forced. It flows naturally from how the child sees themselves. And that's the point where most systems never reach, because they stay focused on control, on correction, on managing behavior from the outside. But this system moves deeper. It builds from the inside. And once something is built internally, it doesn't need constant maintenance. It sustains itself, even when the environment changes, even when pressure increases, even when the child is alone. And that's what makes it powerful. Because real discipline is not about what happens when someone is watching. It's about what happens when they're not. Now think back to the beginning, that moment where everything used to escalate quickly, where the reaction felt automatic, where the outcome felt predictable, and compare it to now. Not perfect, not always calm, but different. More space, more control, more awareness. And that difference didn't come from one big change. It came from many small ones, repeated, consistently, over time. Because the system you build matters more than the moment you react to. Moments pass, systems stay. And when the system is strong, the moments take care of themselves. That's why this approach works. It doesn't fight behavior. It builds the structure behind it. It doesn't try to eliminate difficulty. It uses difficulty as the environment where growth happens. And once you understand that, everything shifts. You stop reacting to what's visible and start focusing on what's underneath. You stop asking how to control the moment and start asking how to build the ability. Because once the ability is there, the moment no longer needs to be controlled. It resolves on its own. And that's the real goal. Not raising a child who behaves well only when guided, but raising a child who can guide themselves, through emotion, through pressure, through difficulty. And that doesn't happen through force. It happens through building. Slowly, quietly, consistently, until one day, what used to be difficult becomes natural. And what used to require control no longer needs it, because it has become part of who they are. And that's the difference. Not temporary behavior, but permanent change.